Hey folks, I'm Alex Dowd.
And I'm Katie Reif.
On today's episode, we're discussing the career of Spike Lee, one of the most iconic and prolific American filmmakers of the last 35 years. He has a new movie, Da 5 Bloods, hitting Netflix today. We'll talk about that and more with a special guest.
Welcome to Film Club. So with movie theaters still closed for the foreseeable future, we've been spotlighting a lot of streaming releases here on Film Club. And this week we have a big one, a new film from Spike Lee. It's called Da 5 Bloods, and it premieres on Netflix this Friday. And so to help us discuss Spike Lee's filmography, we've brought on a special guest, which is Robert Daniels. Hi, Robert.
Hey, Katie. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's our pleasure. Robert is a critic in Chicago, so we see him a lot out and about back in the old days when we would go to screenings a few times a week.
What's a screening?
It's in this place called movie theaters. It used to exist a long, long time ago. So, Robert, you have your own website called 812 Film Reviews. When did you start that?
I started it around 2017 when I was in grad school, and basically wrote for it off and on. And then once I graduated and had a life again, I then started writing more for it. So I've mostly been writing in the last 2 years, attending festivals like TIFF and Sundance and South by Southwest.
And then as well as running your own site, you also freelance for a whole bunch of other sites. Like, give us a few. Read us your resume, Robert.
Yeah, so I freelance for RogerEbert.com, The Playlist, Polygon, Consequence of Sound, and just about anyone else who will take me.
Cool, yeah. And you had an article recently about John Boyega's speaking out against basically telling his racist fans to go fuck themselves on Polygon, and how that related to the Star Wars franchise. That was a really cool article, big hit. So congrats on that, man.
Thanks, Katie.
So as we mentioned up top, we're talking today about Spike Lee, one of the most important American filmmakers of his generation, or really any other. Lee, who has a new movie this week out on Netflix, has made more than 30 features in as many years. He's directed documentaries, television, music videos, comedy specials, commercials, and video games. He's one of few directors, American and otherwise, who's genuinely a household name, in part because of his movies, but also because of the outspoken public persona he's cultivated over the years. Many of Lee's most beloved films concern race in America, but it's by no means the only topic he's tackled in his work. He's made films about music, basketball, Catholicism, generational conflict, many films about New York, serial killers. He's made heist thrillers, and his 25th Hour is arguably the definitive post-9/11 movie.
Spike Lee was born in Atlanta, raised in Brooklyn, and his first film was an NYU student film called Joe's Bed-Stuy Barbershop, We Cut Heads. But his first commercially released film came out in 1986, and that is She's Gotta Have It. And what strikes me about She's Gotta Have It is how strong Lee's style is straight out of the gate. You know, he's got a lot of directorial signatures. He calls them Spikeisms. You know, first and foremost, I think the one everybody knows is he calls his films, all of his films are called a Spike Lee joint. That's the first one. And he does do this in this film. But there are a few other things as well, like the direct address to the camera is a big Spike Lee signature. And it's got a dance sequence in the middle of it. He does love a dance sequence. And that's here in his first film.
I actually rewatched this film recently. I had not seen it in years, since I was probably a teenager when I got into Spike Lee, and it's one of his funniest. And beyond that, I do think it's remarkable how fully formed he was as a creative voice right from the start. I mean, She's Gotta Have It is in some ways a much smaller film than anything he made afterwards. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think it's his most genuinely independent production. Obviously, most of it's in black and white. And it doesn't contain any stars or anything, but I think it absolutely his sense of humor, his sense of style. You mentioned the direct address, characters literally addressing the camera. That's all that right there from the start. I think if you saw this in '86, you would say that guy is going to have a long and strong career.
The term revolutionary is overused, but like for me, when I'm watching She's Gotta Have It, it is like truly revolutionary just because of the comfortability of the characters that he creates. These aren't caricatured blaxploitation portrayals pitched to 100 to be like cartoony or buffoonish, nor are these like race films that became prominent, with Oscar Micheaux and remained in the 60s, espousing middle class urban values. This one, is, even though it's kind of the natural successor to quote unquote race films, because it operates outside the studio system and feels so independent. It's a recording of the several shades of Black lives that makes it special, from upper class creatives to middle class intellectuals and urbanized individuals. Like a character like Mars didn't exist prior to this film, nor did someone like Nola. So Spike isn't really trying to appeal or please a wide audience. These people are people that he knows and people that he's seen, and he's creating them specifically for himself and by virtue for us.
Yeah, and in scenes like the Thanksgiving dinner scene, he kind of has all these different aspects of, people he knows, and like you were saying, different aspects of like Black life at the time. Like they're literally in dialogue with one another, like in the scenes where they're all in the same room. And another thing about this film, I find its sexual politics very progressive, even for 2020. Like polyamory was not a big thing in 1986, but I admire the character of Nola Darling, because she is just she knows what she wants, and I admire that about her. So, as you mentioned, Robert, She's Gotta Have It is a very independent production, and he followed that up with School Days shortly after that. But I think his biggest, he really came to the forefront in 1989 with Do the Right Thing, which was, critical and commercial success, and got Spike Lee his first Oscar nomination for Best Original Screenplay. And of course, he didn't win until 2019 for Klansman, where he had this great quote when he did win Best Original Screenplay, which is, every time somebody is driving somebody, I live. That's a great quote, referring to how they were up against Driving Miss Daisy in 1990 and then Green Book in 2019.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that it was up for an Academy Award, because it was not up for Best Picture that year. It went to Driving Miss Daisy, and that was a source of some irritation with many people, including a lot of film critics. And at the Oscars, I remember Kim Basinger on stage actually called them out for snubbing the film. Lee, over the years, has had a contentious relationship with the Academy Awards, who have often ignored some of his I think some of his best and most ambitious work, although he's occasionally picked up nominations over the years before finally winning with Klansman. Do the Right Thing was it was not just a hit, it was a controversial film at the time, partially because I think there was a lot of racist debate that the film was going to inspire a lot of rioting in the cities or something.
Sure, and something that Spike Lee says in the commentary for the film is that over the years he's been asked by a lot of white journalists if he thought that Mookie does the right thing towards the end of the film. I'm not going to say exactly what that is in case you haven't seen it, but if you haven't seen it, you need to do it right now. But he noted that it's only white journalists that ask him if Mookie does the right thing, which is a very interesting observation. Now, but the film is, at this point, when the National Film Registry was started in 1999, Do the Right Thing was brought in right away. And I think at this point it is kind of recognized as a classic. Would you call it an instant classic, though? Like, with the critical response at the time?
I think it was an instant classic, and I think that was reflected in its at least its critical reception at the time, and. Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably the best movie of the 1980s, honestly. I saw the film when I was a teenager, and I remember one of the things that it was the first Spike Lee movie I had seen, and I saw it at a time in which I was starting to take in more movies by significant directors. I was starting to explore some of the history of cinema, and I remember thinking at the time that this was... well, actually, this is probably me retroactively applying this lens to it, honestly. But I think partially what was going on when I was watching it for the first time was I was seeing for the first time a filmmaker who was putting himself, his personality, his ideas into every frame of the film in a way that I probably didn't understand when I first watched it. I think I was grasping the notion of auteurism watching Do the Right Thing, because so much of Lee is embedded in so much of that film.
I saw this first in high school, so it's been over a decade. And the first time I saw it, it brought questions that I had never confronted. The idolatry of white heroes and the way that Spike Lee disintegrates them, right, felt militant at the time, and up until probably about 3 weeks ago still felt pretty militant. And I also gravitate toward the symbolism of Ossie Davis and Ruby Dee's character as patriarch and matriarch of the neighborhood, in a neighborhood where there are noticeably very few black people of their age, and the fact that Smiley sells pictures of Malcolm and Martin meeting together the one time they met together in person, and how that translates to the dearth of patriarchal and matriarchal figures within the neighborhood that can steer the young tempestuous black figures that quote unquote might have led to a riot.
Another thing about this film, and I think that's something that I appreciate about Spike Lee's filmography in general, is that yes, it does deal with, big issues like police murder and brutality and a lot of, like you were talking about, the figures in the neighborhood and things like that. And it refers to a lot of this stuff, but it's also a very colorful film, and a lot of it is very fun to watch. And even the character of the mayor and his romancing of mother-sister it's comedic and it's sweet. And there's a really great, it's a really vibrant, I guess is the word I would use, the way that it depicts like this one block of this neighborhood and just every aspect of it, from the traumatic to the joyful, all in the course of one day. Just the way he sets that all up, that sort of structure is really suited to his style. I think it all comes together beautifully.
Yeah, it's I'm amazed at how consistently hilarious the film is, on top of being about very, very serious things and ending in, I will tread carefully here. One could say there's some tragedy at the end of this film, but on a whole, it's just, it is a movie alive with the personalities that Lee puts on screen. I mean, nobody in this movie is a caricature, and he does create this entire. It's like he creates this entire little petri dish of a neighborhood, basically, and I think he sees it as kind of a microcosm of America in the 80s, and I think as we're seeing right now as well.
The idea of auteurism and the fact that like Spike Lee is literally in every frame of that film, and the fact that it leans so directly into the styles of the 80s, like it just isn't like the best film of the 80s, probably. It's also emblematic of that period, not just in the political conversations, but the styles, the colors, the textures, and the music.
And of course, Lee he's made a lot of movies since Do the Right Thing. It really we're not going to go through each one by one. He's had a very long career with a lot of films, but I do want to mention his follow-up to Do the Right Thing, which is Mo Better Blues, which came out in 1990, because it introduced one of the most quintessential Spike Lee signatures, which is the double dolly shot. And how that works is the effect when you're watching the film is it looks like the actor is floating. But what it is when you have an actor and standing on a platform that the camera is also on, and they're both dollying or moving at the same time, and it gives the effect that someone is floating. There's some other examples of this. Do you guys, any notable ones that come to mind for either of you guys?
He's used it in a bunch of his films. I mean, I think it shows up in 25th Hour as well. I think most recently it's in Black Klansman. I think he, at a certain point, he realized that this was a signature for him. It creates a sort of sense, not just that the actor is floating, but that we're sort of almost occupying the physical, mental, maybe spiritual space of this character as they move through a location.
The other example I can think of a double dolly is an Inside Man, which does like take us into the double dolly can also foreshadow like the emotions that the character will act out on.
And that film is also notable because it was Lee's first collaboration with Denzel Washington, with whom he's done 4 films. And then Denzel Washington's son, John David Washington, starred in Black Klansman. So that's one of But he has a few behind the scenes folks too that he works with regularly, but we'll get to that in a minute. I wanted to that takes us to another Spike Lee signature that the best example, perhaps not the best example, but the one that first comes to mind for me is the beginning of Malcolm X, and that is the political montage. Are there any of those that come to mind for you guys?
There's one that ends Bamboozle that's enormously powerful, I think, just sort of exploring the history of racist imagery in American pop culture. I think we'll get to that movie later when we start talking about favorites. But yeah, I think it's one of Lee's most effective techniques and I think he's really a master at this at sort of assembling these montages of real life events. Defy Blood starts with one that's enormously powerful. There's one in Black Klansman as well. His ability to sort of give us this speedy primer of American history and his sort of ability to give us this speedy primer on American history. It can often create this really strong context for whatever the fictional narrative is that comes after it. Or before it, for that matter.
One of the most interesting things about the way that he uses the montage is that it's not just to like highlight American history, but it's also to highlight Black history, a history that is either sometimes well known or not very well known, and can definitely help to explain the motivations of the characters and his narrative.
I alluded to Spike Lee having, a long career, and I'm just going to name off a few titles. In 1991, he put out Jungle Fever, 92, Malcolm X, Crooklyn, Clockers, Girl 6, Get on the Bus, He Got Game, Summer of Sam, Bamboozled, 25th Hour, She Hate Me, Inside Man, Miracle at St. Anna, Red Hook Summer, Old Boy, The Sweet Blood of Jesus, Chirac, Black Klansman, and now The Five Bloods. And this whole time, he has always, another thing about Spike Lee is he is never fully committed to Hollywood or the studio system. He is undoubtedly a major auteur filmmaker, very recognizable name as a filmmaker, but he's always sort of maintained distance from that. And I wonder, he's also a professor at NYU, and I wonder if that gives him a little bit of freedom, in the sense that he doesn't have to, he's got a backup, basically. He's got another source of income.
Well, it should be noted that, Spike Lee has worked in the Hollywood system quite a lot over the years. And
sure,
I think,
but not exclusively. He's always kept it at arm's length a little bit. And he's been critical of the system as well.
He has. I think the main issue is that he has mostly maintained a degree of, I wouldn't even entirely say creative control, because he's had pushback from the studios over the years. I think in recent years, for example, his version, so he did the remake of Old Boy, which, by the way, is very much a Spike Lee film in a lot of ways, in some of its signatures, in some of its ideas, even as it operates in some respects as almost a scene-for-scene remake of the Park Chan-wook movie, but there's sort of famously that his original cut of that, the sequence where the main character is basically has been mysteriously jailed, is reported to have run an hour, and the studio balked at that. I believe his next film had it had the usual moment at the beginning of the credits where it says a Spike Lee joint. I think it said an official Spike Lee joint, which was, I think, a nod to the fact that they did not allow his version. I would love to see a version where that sequence is an hour long. I really would. But I think over the years, he's worked in Hollywood, but I think that we've never seen him. I've never seen a movie of his where I've thought, well, that was a total sellout move, or there's no Spike in that film. Even something like Inside Man, which is a commercial thriller in a lot of ways. That's very much a crowd pleaser. That has tons of his personality in it. I don't know if he would be capable of making a movie where his idea, his sort of his abundance of ideas and personality doesn't peek through the cracks.
Yeah, Inside Man is the one that I would cite as the one that is the most, the idea of one for me, one for them. That is the closest to one for them that he's done. But like you said, it still has a lot of his signatures in it.
It's still for him, it's still very much a Spike Lee movie. It's just a Spike Lee movie in the key of a crowd-pleasing heist thriller.
Mm-hmm.
Spike has always made films for himself. However, there's rarely been a studio that's come to Spike and said, hey, like, we want our name attached to Spike Lee's film in perpetuity, like, Paramount recently did with Scorsese, and then later fell out of, but recently did with Scorsese. So it's only been recently that the financial viability of black directed films, especially ones with political overtones that don't necessarily cater to the middle taste of like white audiences, have become awards darlings for studios and even box office hits. So there's always been this perception of Spike as a quote unquote risky bet, especially as he's been outspoken against not just studios, but also the lack of diversity in studios, the lack of executives that have green light authority. And so it's always been interesting to see a director of Spike's pedigree, or maybe not even interesting, but sometimes I don't know, saddening to see a director of Spike Lee's pedigree, and yet like recently he dropped the script that he'd been writing for the Jackie Robinson biopic, which for some reason can't find a financial backer. And you would think Spike Lee, Jackie Robinson, that combo would immediately just shout commerciality, but it's always been a difficult journey for him to get studio backing. And so I think some of his arm's distance from studio system hasn't always been of his own choice.
Yeah.
I mean, in recent years, he right before Black Klansman, he actually did make a run of very independent films that sort of almost returned him to his 80s roots of making movies on very, very small budgets. I think both Red Hook Summer and The Sweet Blood of Jesus are one would say very independent movies.
And I mentioned that he's worked with Denzel Washington a bunch of times, and now his son. But I wanted to mention a few other people that he's worked with a lot over the years. Ruth E. Carter, who is one of the few costume designers who has widespread name recognition. She's worked on a lot of his films, not all of them. But beginning with School Days, they started working together. But composer Terrence Blanchard, who is a very interesting person in his own right, I recommend looking him up. He's worked with Spike Lee since Jungle Fever, and he also has an editor. His name's Barry Alexander Brown, who's worked with him since School Days. So it's a great point that it is not entirely by choice, but he does sort of have his own island. He's got his own Spike Lee kind of crew that exists separately from the larger system. And so we've talked a lot about his style being very idiosyncratic and strong and personality driven, and how it came straight out of the gate from his first film. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Now, I personally like the more idiosyncratic Spike Lee. I'd rather watch perhaps this is blasphemous, but I'd rather watch Chirac than Inside Man. I think it's interesting when he goes in different wild directions.
For me, when Spike doesn't work, I think Spike is one of the funniest directors out there. I mean, we've talked about it already with Do the Right Thing being a funny film on top of its social commentary and racial commentary. But I think sometimes tonally his sense of humor doesn't always match the subject matter. So yeah, in Chirac, you have the end sex battle scene after the women have gone on a sex strike to end gun violence in Chicago. So you have this heady subject of gun violence that is punctuated by this end scene between Dupree, played by Nick Cannon, and Lysistra, played by Teyona Paris. And there is a bit of, Spike sometimes has a bit of juvenile humor.
Yes.
And I don't necessarily think it works there with that subject matter. I feel the same way in The Miracle at St. Anna, where you have the Samuel, we have Train, who's this big black soldier and this is set during World War II, obviously. And he becomes the protector of this Italian boy who's left speechless after witnessing a massacre. But the boy calls him Chocolate Giant, and then Train is kind of mentally showed as I don't want to say like I'm just dumb, basically. It's basically shown as dumb and bug-eyed, and like there's almost like this Bojangles character vibes to like the Italian boy being like a Shirley Temple, which feels like oddly tone deaf to me considering the subject matter.
That's his worst movie in my opinion, but because that one is also, I think, super maudlin, which is another thing that occasionally creeps into his films. Is some kind of broad sentimentality as well. I agree that I think when he's doing comedy, when he's explicitly doing comedy, the sensibilities can be a little crass for my taste. I mean, I've never been a big fan of Girl 6 or of She Hate Me, although I would say that She Hate Me is one that also underlines that he is a filmmaker who is always, and this is not the worst problem to have as a filmmaker, but he is always packing, he's always throwing everything and the kitchen sink into his films, So you'll sometimes see one of his movies that's it's rare that he'll do a film that's 2.5 hours, and he is packing everything he can think into it. And again, I don't think having too many ideas is that bad of a problem to have. But I think sometimes when a Spike movie goes off the rails, it's because he is basically just chasing these detours. I think there's a lot of that in She Hate Me, for example.
Yeah, I mean, even I would agree. I think even in his best films, like Black Klansman is doing that to a point too, where, we're gonna talk about the Five Bloods in a bit, but but Black Klansman, I always find the last 20 minutes to be the weakest part of the film.
Agreed.
It's incredibly superfluous. It really is Spike trying to fit as much as he can, including the double dolly, and then it's also at the same time this film that has been staunchly militant suddenly turns conciliatory toward the end, and it totally doesn't vibe, and yeah, I mean, I will always applaud the willingness to just throw it at the wall and see if it sticks, but yeah, sometimes it gets him into trouble.
I do think it's interesting that you mentioned Black Klansman, and in that end stretch, we were talking earlier about Do the Right Thing, which is I think a film that looks extremely timely right now, and probably has never gone out of fashion in that respect. Has looked timely in the 30 years since its release. Black Klansman, though, and its kind of olive branch that it extends to the police, I think now suddenly looks a little out of step with the moment.
Yeah, certainly. And I know that was, this was a conversation among a lot of Black critics about even the idea of Ron Stallworth, and a cop being, the sentimental, heroic center of the film was controversial in and of itself, especially considering that the first assignment that Stallworth has is spying on Kwame Ture, who's who's this obviously massive civil rights figure. So yeah, looking at what's going on right now, 2 years ago, I think it was released, Black Klansman. If 2 years ago feels like a millennium ago now.
Yeah. To its credit, I will say that I think Black Klansman is even aware of that issue. That's part of the dialogue of the film. I mean, you literally have a character who is taking him to task for being part of the police force. I remember when these criticisms came out, Spike Lee came out and said, I'm never going to say that all police officers are bad. And I wonder what he would say about that today. I'm not sure.
Well, speaking of things being highly relevant to the present day, let's talk about The Five Bloods. So this movie was something, this one also opens with a politically charged montage. And what struck me about this, I've been thinking a lot in recent days about how the late 60s seem to be an interesting parallel to our current moment. And this film really it grapples with that. The basic plot of it is that there is a group of Black Vietnam veterans who go back to Vietnam ostensibly on sort of a tourist trip, and to also find their friend who was killed in action and to bury him. But really, they are there to dig up and cash in on a cache of gold that they found and buried during the Vietnam War. And you have a core group, a bunch of actors who have worked with Spike Lee before. He brings back a bunch of people. Delroy Lindo, who was in Malcolm X, Clark Peters, who was in Red Hook Summer, Norm Lewis, who, this is tangential, but he was in the TV series, the Netflix TV series of She's Gotta Have It, and Isaiah Whitlock Jr., who several of these guys were on The Wire, by the way. But Isaiah Whitlock Jr. has done 5 films with Spike Lee: Chirac, Red Hood Summer, Black Klansman, 25th Hour, and then this one. And then you have Jonathan Majors, who is on the upcoming Lovecraft Country as the son, and Chadwick Boseman as their comrade, who was sort of the leader of their group, who was killed in action back in Vietnam. The script was written by Spike Lee and Kevin Wilmot, who also collaborated with him on Black Klansman and Chirac. And so one thing I thought was interesting about this one is those two, they did a rewrite of a script. But the original script was written by Danny Bilson and Paul DeMeo, who are best known for their work with the direct-to-video horror studio Full Moon Pictures back in the 90s. They did Trancers. They wrote Trancers, and now they're doing a Spike Lee film.
That's funny. I have to imagine that the script is a little different than it was.
I imagine
it's probably a pretty big rewrite. You know?
It was probably just the concept of Vietnam veterans going back to get gold, if I had to guess.
there is an exploitation film element to the movie. This sort of idea of returning to the jungles of Vietnam, and the movie does at some point kind of turn into a bit of an action film. I would say a little bit to its detriment, personally. I really liked this film when it's operating as kind of a hangout movie with these characters. You know, they don't really get back to the jungles of Vietnam until like an hour of screen time has passed, and that first hour we're just kind of hanging out with these 4 men, these older men who served together in Vietnam. And Lee is just kind of luxuriating in the personalities he's created and in the chemistry between these actors. It reminded me a little bit of Linklater's Last Flag Flying, actually, where we're just seeing this reunion of people who used to be soldiers.
Yeah, I also liked the first hour of the movie quite a bit. It was, I think, my favorite part of the film. I thought there was some kind of sharp, fun, really funny commentary in there. Like there's towards the beginning of the film. When they first arrive, they're there for some sort of, I guess it's a Vietnam veterans reunion of some sort in Vietnam. And so, you see the screen and it says Apocalypse Now, and they pull back and you see the Budweiser logo and all these people partying. I thought that was a really, really sharp joke.
Yeah, I would agree that I think the first hour is definitely the strongest. After that, it gets pretty clunky with transitioning between Academy ratio and widescreen, and then the idea that in the flashback scenes that Spike didn't recast with younger actors.
Yeah,
I know.
That was something.
No Irishman digital trickery there. They just look exactly the same.
Yeah. This is definitely what you would call one of the looser Spike Lee movies, one of the more idiosyncratic ones. You said it turns into an action film towards the end now, but something that I really know, I was like, this is a very dialogue-driven action movie.
It's very talky. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if the character motivations make a ton of sense. I think we get some kind of wild, Robert, you mentioned earlier veers in tone too. There's some big ones in this film. So we'll have this kind of these sort of jovial scenes of the characters just sort of shooting the shit, and then also a scene of somebody being blown up by a landmine in very graphic detail. These moments are sometimes sitting like side by side.
It was, weirdly enough, it was like the first thing it reminded me of is it was Quentin Tarantino a bit.
Oh, yeah, those two famously
violence,
are rivals.
Yeah, yeah.
I do think this is a much stronger film than his other war movie, which we mentioned earlier, which is Miracle at St. Anna, which I think that movie succumbs to a lot of some of the worst cliches of big budget war movies. I think this one has at least has a lot more personality than that film does, even though it also repeats the device of one of the enemies, the enemy side basically broadcasting propaganda to the black soldiers, basically encouraging them to deflect because they're fighting for a country that doesn't respect them, that brutalizes them back home. I think that's, and I do think that's one of the stronger through lines of the film. There's this, there's this amazingly powerful film or a moment in the film early on where all of them hear via one of these broadcasts. They hear that Martin Luther King has been assassinated. They did not know that at the time. Obviously, there's no internet in the 1960s. Lee basically handles it with he basically splits the screen into 5 quadrants, and we see each actor's reaction to that information.
Yeah, I think there were a lot of interesting ideas in this film, which is why ultimately, even though, like in terms of like action thrills, I don't go into it looking for that, but I think there are a lot of interesting ideas in this film. There's another scene early on where they talk about how that when they came back to the US they were received poorly, and just sort of it kind of delves into these interesting middle areas where you have these guys participating. On the one hand, they're fighting for a country that does not value them. But on the other hand, they are also, tools of that government, and they have to kind of reconcile with that as well. Like there's a scene early on where they're in a floating market, and, one of the vendors in the market starts yelling at them, "You killed my mom and dad, you killed my mom and dad, you're GIs." And I think there's some interesting tension in the film with that idea as well.
What does everyone think of the way Spike handles Lindo's character, who it's revealed that of the 4 veterans that he's become basically like a MAGA guy? He voted for Donald Trump. How do you guys feel about
that? So, yeah, I don't know. Spike partly, obviously Black Klansman partly is a commentary on Trump. And it feels like when it does that in Black Klansman, he veers far out of the way of, the story that he's trying to tell. However, I think it works better here, just because Delroy's character serves as, as a commentary on Trump's like corrupting rhetoric, how it preys on the vulnerability of the self-thought disaffected, or people who believe they've been wronged or stolen from. Now in the case of Delroy, he probably has been, but I find it interesting the way that he manifests that. And also I find it interesting that like Delroy obviously is, without spoiling too much, is a person who has lost a father figure, and that immediately makes him a terrible father figure. And without that guiding light that is his Malcolm, that is his MLK, he falls prey to the worst elements of American political thought.
Yeah, and talking about Trump does come up pretty naturally in a story about Americans abroad, it's something that comes up when you go abroad.
I think it's much more natural in this film than it is in Black Klansman. Honestly, Black Klansman. One of the things I do not care for about that film, even though as much as I like it, is I do feel that occasionally some of the sort of the winks to what's happening now are a little on the nose. The film sort of going out of its way to sort of nudge us in the ribs about the fact that. That there are some parallels between what's happening in the late 70s and what was happening, what's happening right now. This film, I think, is a little bit more organic about that. I do think also that Lindo, I think that his character is probably the most interesting in this group. I think it's a strong performance. there's a part of me that couldn't help that. I mean, this is a larger critique of the film. I do kind of wish that the movie could just continue to hang out with these characters, that it didn't have to turn into this. There's this whole Treasure of the Sierra Madre thing where it's like it turns into like there's some gold that they're all trying to get their hands on, and I found myself gravitating back towards these characters. What have their lives been like over the last few decades? I wanted to know more about that, and maybe less of a focus on some of the mechanics of the war movie that it turns into.
Yeah, and then to piggyback on the Treasure of Sierra Madre, and Spike Lee being way too on the nose with his references of what he's referring to, even lifting the line, we don't need no stinking badges.
Yeah,
it's just he's almost consumed by narratively and stylistically matching that film, that it takes away from the gem that he has of having these characters existing in each other's spaces, and catching up and dealing with their respective psychological and emotional traumas.
Okay, so getting towards the end here, I just want to wrap things up by asking everybody, what is your favorite Spike Lee movie? We all named one, which is, an undisputed classic masterpiece, which is Do the Right Thing. And then, what were your other choices, Dowd?
Okay, so I'm a huge fan of Bamboozled. So that was a film of his that came out the sort of turn of the century in 2000. It was not very well received at the time. It was at least divisively received. It's basically a satire that casts Damon Wayans as he basically is a black executive at a major TV studio, and in kind of a producer's like scheme decides to come up. He basically is looking to get out of his contract. He hates working there, so he comes up with this scheme to get out of it by basically creating this extremely racist. It's basically like a modern minstrel show that he'll put on television, and the idea is that if the show will be immediately denounced by America, and he'll be fired, and he'll be out of his contract. The show is not denounced by America. By the way, it involves he basically pulls two street performers in as stars, and two black street performers, and they put blackface on, and the America loves it, and a lot of America sort of defends their appreciation for it on like ironic terms. They're like, oh, it's aware of itself or something, and the whole film becomes this I would say this pretty withering critique of the notion that racism does not exist in America anymore, but also of the idea that it mutates to survive in other ways. And in this case, I think Lee is sort of taking aim at the use of ironic racism in certain American pop culture entertainment, and the endurance of racist imagery. I think it's one of his most powerful films. It's not a perfect film. I mean, I think few of his films are perfect. Actually, I don't believe in perfect films, period, but I do think that there are a few issues with the film, and it, having been made in the early 2000s and shot on video, it's a movie that often some of it looks kind of crude because you're looking at early 2000s digital, which is not something that looks great, I think, often, but I think this is not just his most underrated film, but one of his most powerful.
And you chose Bamboozled as well, Robert.
Yeah, I did. I agree with all of Alex's points. And Bamboozled. I mean, it's just, I think it's probably Spike Lee's most brazen film, just because of the high wire act of portraying blackface, and the fact that Spike Lee in that film doesn't completely denigrate the historical legacy of blackface. Blackface for a time was the only way that black performers could earn a living, could get, parts in minstrel shows. And it really comes through in Ruthie Carter's beautiful and vibrant costumes. And then obviously Spike Lee's love of song and dance comes through too, and his adoration with classic MGM musicals visually comes through as well. And then it also demonstrates, racism that's present in television boardrooms, right? And how much control Black creatives have over the art that they in this case, the art that they put out to the masses. There's a scene where Pierre sends in his pilot, and it's ready to go. It's ready to film. And the white executive basically does rewrites and believes that he knows Black culture better than this Black person. And I also think Bamboozle has one of my favorite scenes, I think, in Spike Lee's career, which is when they first perform this TV show in front of a live audience. The fact that Spike Lee had assembled this audience of extras and did not tell them that they were going to be watching a blackface show. So when he does the reaction shots to the crowd, those are real reaction shots.
Wow.
I did not know that. Wow.
I think everything about it, it's one of the most brazen films Spike's ever made.
It's definitely one of his angriest.
Well, your other choice, Robert, was Get on the Bus, which came out in 96.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, Ossie Davis as an actor, thankfully got a late career charge from being in Spike Lee's films. And he's always known for, his famous line in Do the Right Thing. But my favorite performance of his in a Spike Lee film is in Get on the Bus. I love, and sometimes I get sensibilities of Get on the Bus and The Five Bloods. There's this one scene where Melvin is filming everything with the Super 8 camera, and there's a similar conceit in Get on the Bus with this character X, who is a film school and is recording this group of Black men who are heading to the Million Man March in Washington. Similarly, it's also a spiritual pilgrimage for everyone on board as they explain their past traumas and what it means to be Black in America.
So your other choice, Dad, was one of Spike Lee's documentaries, which you should note. He's done a lot of great documentaries over the years. Four Little Girls is one that was also very powerful. That's one of my favorites. But you picked When the Levees Broke.
Yes. So that is a 4-hour documentary he made for HBO in 2006. It's a documentary about Hurricane Katrina and specifically about the government's botched response to it. And I think that Lee is actually he's a fabulous, I think, documentary filmmaker. I think that there's a deep amount of control about what he's doing as a documentary filmmaker. I think that he both in the choosing of his subjects, but also in the sort of I would say almost the moral clarity of how he assembles the films as well. I think When the Levees Broke is such an exhaustive exploration of that subject. I mean, it really puts its 4 hours to use. And it ends up operating, I think, simultaneously as like a procedural about what went wrong there. It's sort of a snapshot of the natural disaster, but also of the government's botched response to it. But it's also a celebration of New Orleans, and I think it's an enormously moving and vital piece of journalism above anything else, maybe.
Well, I just want to take a minute to thank once again Robert Daniels for being our guest today. Thank you so much for coming on, Robert.
Thanks for having me, Katie and Alex.
Yep, thank you.
You can find Robert online at 812filmreviews.com, and his Twitter handle is at 812filmreviews. Robert will be reviewing The Five Bloods for the playlist this week, so check that out, and we'll also run a review of the film on the AV Club later this week. Thank you so much for joining us for a special edition of Film Club. Please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
This week's episode of Film Club was hosted by me, Alex Dowd, and by Katie Reif. It was produced and edited by Carl Blumberg. Our sound mixer and finishing editor is Seth Hafer, and our motion graphics designer is Julie Mullins. We'll be back next week with a brand new episode. Thanks for listening.
Bye, everybody.